It is very exciting to have a program on New Year's. We haven't had a program on New Year's at Beth Tikva in at least as long as I've been here. And I imagine for a while, because we don't generally do New Year's. Everyone's away. Everybody's in Florida, everybody's with their family, everybody's on vacation. But this year, due to COVID, we had decided that we were going to do some more winter programming. And this New Year's Eve is one of those things. And it's tough because usually, as a rabbi, I hate Jewish New Year's. It's a whole lot of work for me, but secular New Year's is pretty easy. There's nothing going on at the synagogue. A minyan, and that's really it. But this year, I had to do this, and I had to think of something to say, something to do at the beginning. And I decided that I would just do the same thing I do for the secular New Year's. Since we're doing a comedy show, I figured I would just share some words from somebody else. So I have here my Jewish book of humor, and I thought maybe there's a couple of things there, but we're not really going to do that. We're going to do some real jokes in a minute. What I wanted to do is look at the year in review. So I'm going to share really quickly up on the screen. I hope everybody can see it. I wanted to share just a quick slideshow because I wanted to take a look and see Beth Tikva in the year that has just passed us. It's been a long year. It's been a difficult year. And so much has changed. We used to have the sanctuary full of people, full of singing and praying and dancing and laughter and joy and all sorts of other things. And this year, instead, it's mostly sat relatively empty. There has not been so much going on there. And yet, there's been other changes too, some that you may not have noticed. Our clergy and our staff have become very talented in the side of production. We could all go get jobs now in Hollywood. We could get jobs downtown on a set in here in Toronto. There's been a lot of behind the scenes production work that we've all been learning. New skills, one might say, that I don't think the Chazan or the other Rabbi Grover or I ever really imagined would be something we'd be doing in our rabbinate. And yet at the same time, we've become very traditional. Our communities really turned to tablets, just like in the past, as a way of connecting with God and a way of seeking the divine. But that's not the only thing that really has stayed the same. We've gone from in-person minyan to virtual minyan with Irv and Chazan Kavari leading us. We've gone to Havdalah every week from in-person programs to now doing it online and bringing in members of the community. We've transitioned from in-person classes and lectures to a whole bunch of classes and programs online, opportunities for people to learn. We have even more classes and even more classes. And it goes on, but I don't want to do too many slides. But it's shocking to me when I looked back at this year, how many different classes have been going on here at Beth Tikva. We've had all sorts of youth and young family programs, both virtually and in person, socially distanced when we've been able to safely, which has really been a treat. So that too has continued even in the year of COVID. All sorts of different programs from cooking to wine tasting to paint night and many, many others. Even though we've been doing them virtually, our community's gotten to come together to share in all sorts of different experiences, which has been phenomenal. Shabbat, it's different, and yet it's really been beautiful, from our summer Friday night Kabbalat Shabbat outdoors to Shabbat morning services now being broadcast virtually, and of course our incredibly talented Chazan and the Beth Tikva Funk Band who've been leading us on Friday nights for the past couple of months. It's been a special treat this year. Celebrations, from virtual weddings, bar mitzvahs, baby namings, all of that, it's been different, and yet it stayed the same. We found ways this year as a community of sanctifying life's most special moments, life's sacred moments. And it's also been, for me personally, and I know for the community, it's been a good year because we had the royal wedding, which was, I don't know about you, but I had a lot of fun at it, at least. And I know everybody had a good laugh when the Chazan had to help me out with the rings there. So it's been a good year. Some things have changed, right? We're not gathering together in person. We're not eating food like we used to. And yet, a lot of things have stayed the same. And we're still getting to do all sorts of things virtually, getting to enjoy each other's company. and getting to really be together as a community. And tonight, as we celebrate the secular New Year's, we're going to, in just a moment, have a comedian join us, Joel Chasnoff, who's a really fantastic comic. And some people might ask, what is a synagogue doing celebrating New Year's? What is a synagogue doing with comedy? But there's really nothing more Jewish than comedy. Telling jokes has been how our people have gotten through difficulties for generations. I think the very first Jewish joke, you shouldn't Google it because it will give you a different answer. But the very first joke that Jews told that I can find is way back in the Talmud. It's a pun. There's the verse from the Torah, Micha mocha ba'elim Adonai, right? Who is like you, God, among the mighty? But there was a time in the rabbinic history when things weren't going so well. And the rabbis had a pun and they said, who is like you instead of ba'elim Adonai? Ba'ilim, who is like you among the mute instead of the mighty? They did a rabbinic pun. And I think that's really the first time the rabbis told a joke. And since then, rabbis have been telling a joke in times of trouble, in times of difficulty, and also in times of joy. And it goes all the way from back then through the Marx Brothers, through Midge Maisel, for those of you who have Amazon Prime like I do, and Jackie Mason, and all sorts of other great comedians. And that's what we're here to do tonight, to say that this year's been tough, this year's been difficult, but in the end, we're going to raise a glass to it, and we're going to laugh, and we're going to enjoy ourselves, and we're going to celebrate. And with that, it's really my honor and pleasure to invite a very phenomenal, not just comedian, but really a great guy, Joel Chasnoff. I first met him a number of years ago. He was the artist in residence at Camp Ramah for Passover while I was there. And it was really a treat getting to meet him and his family and getting to participate in all the different programs that he did to make us all laugh. He's got a great book, The 188th Crybaby Brigade, which I won't tell you too much about because he may or may not talk about that tonight. But he's joining us not just from very far away in Israel, but also from far away, all the way in the future. He's in 2021. So Joel, welcome back in time to 2020. Thank you for joining us here at Beth Tikva in Toronto. And I'll let everybody have what they want. Please give a Zoom round of applause for Joel Chasnoff.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Sachs. And actually, you're cracking me up. It's very true. I am speaking to people literally living in a different year than I am. It's very, very bizarre. And on the one hand, I can joke about how things are different here in the future, but I must say they are different here in the future. There is something mentally that feels different about being in the new year, sort of a new mental space that we can exist in, one of hope, one of difference from what we just went through. And I think comedy is a great way to usher in the new year. So I'm happy you did this. And the rabbi brought up a big point about humor and Jews. And I think it's fast. This is a topic I'm actually very interested in, is when Jews started telling jokes. And I didn't know about that Talmudic passage. I do know the Talmud has a lot of humor. But in terms of when we Jews actually began doing things like joking around, I might actually turn to the book of Exodus as one of the first examples of Jewish humor. There's this great verse. The Jews are fleeing Egypt, and Pharaoh is chasing them, and all his chariots are bearing down upon them. And the Jews turn to Moses, and they do something that only Jewish people would dare to do. They ask a sarcastic question. They say to Moses, Moses, were there not enough graves in Egypt that you had to drag us out here to die? So Jewish. They could have said, let's move faster. They could have said, why did you bring us out here? But instead they said, were there not enough graves in Egypt? A very sarcastic, one-sided, biting question. And that's another thing Jews do, is we ask a lot of questions. And I think that's why there are so many Jewish comedians, is because we're a question-asking people. And a lot of our best Jewish jokes end with a question being asked. And if the very first example of this is in the Garden of Eden. It's not a joke, but it's someone answering a question with a question. Cain kills his brother Abel, and the first ever example of siblings in the history of the world. One brother kills the other. And God says to Cain, where is your brother? And what does Cain say? Am I my brother's keeper? A very Jewish response, answering the question with the question. So this is quite a tradition we have, and I think it's a great way to usher in the new year. We're now up to 222 people in our audience, which is just amazing. I think it says a lot also about what we're all seeking during this very challenging time. So I'm happy you could join us. I know you're all on mute. I just want to address that really quick. There are actually three theories that comedians have about performing online in terms of the audience. And I've tried them all. One group of comedians, they like to have everybody off of mute so they can hear the laughter. Another group likes to have 3 or 4 people off mute, but everyone else muted. That way they have 3 or 4 designated laughers who can give them a little bit of laughter, but the rest of the people are quiet. And then there are those comedians like me who prefer to have everyone on mute. It's not that I don't want to hear the laughter, but what I've discovered is that with 223 screens, if even one person opens a bag of potato chips during this performance, everybody hears it. And we saw this during the introduction. For me, the funniest part of these shows is when everyone first joins the Zoom meeting and they're all chatting back and forth. And I can listen to you guys talking. Everybody forgets that everyone else can hear what you're saying. So people are saying things like, "Have you heard of this guy? Is he funny? I don't know. It's free, so it doesn't matter." I can hear all the things that you guys are thinking that I could never hear during a live show. So in my case, I do have you on mute. I actually think mute is one of those things that just might be one of the silver linings of this pandemic. Certainly, many rabbis have told me that mute has fulfilled their biggest dream as a rabbi, which is the ability to mute the entire congregation with the push of a button. One rabbi once told me that to be a rabbi, you don't just have to love Judaism, you have to love Jews. And it takes a lot to love Jews consistently day in and day out. But mute finally affords our rabbis a chance to make the Jews go quiet every once in a while. That might be something they all look back on with a smile as we do move past this pandemic. Uh, in terms of where I'm coming to you from, Ra'anana, Israel, the foyer of my living room right outside of Tel Aviv. It is just about 10 minutes before 3 o'clock in the morning. And usually, when you do a comedy show, they introduce you with a very long bio saying your credits. But what I found is that one of the great things about performing on Zoom is I don't have to be introduced with the bio. I can instead show you who I am. That's the golden rule of show business, right? Show, don't tell. So I actually put together a quick little PowerPoint here to let you know who I am. This says, Takiru et Yoel, meet your comedian. So my name is Joel Chasnoff, and I have been performing stand-up comedy for just about 20 years now. I began in 2001 as my full-time job. And I'm also the author of this book, The 188th Crybaby Brigade, which Rabbi Sachs mentioned. This is my comedic memoir about my service in the Israeli army. Now, when you're a Jewish comedian, people have a lot of questions for you. They're always very curious about that career. One of them is, who is your favorite comedian of all time? Who inspired you? And for me, the answer is actually quite simple. My first favorite comedian and still is the wild and crazy guy, Steve Martin. I remember I first heard about Steve Martin when I was about 6 or 7 years old. He was on The Muppet Show. I don't know if you remember that show or had it in Canada, but when I was a kid at Saturday nights around 8 o'clock, they had The Muppet Show and they would have real guests on. And Steve Martin was often on there. He was goofy. He wore shorts and bunny ears, and I could relate to him. And to this day, I still think he's a comedic genius. The other question people ask is, when did you start performing comedy? And I actually happen to have a picture of my very first ever stand-up comedy performance. This is me delivering the Dvar Torah at the luncheon after my bar mitzvah at Congregation B'nai Emunah in Skokie, Illinois. Parashat Shemot, which is, I believe, coming up next weekend. And I was already doing a few things right, holding the microphone correctly, working the crowd with my non-dominant hand, all the things you're supposed to do as a comic. And I was always a small kid, and I felt a little overwhelmed by others. And I think humor gave me a way to sort of stand out. and get a little bit of attention that maybe I couldn't get by being big and powerful the way others were. So that's when I first started doing comedy. Now, in first of my first paid gig, well, my first paid performance was right here. I don't know if some of you recognize this. You might, because your Toronto Blue Jays played them in the World Series. This is the old Veterans Stadium in Philadelphia. The Philadelphia Phillies were the first professional sports team to hire a group of improvisers, actors, to go around the stadium trying to entertain the fans during the games. We would throw out t-shirts and run quizzes and do improvised skits. This is me right here in the middle, dressed as the Joker on Superhero Day. This job taught me a lot about comedy because there's no audience harder than trying to entertain 40,000 extremely drunk Philadelphia Phillies fans. They're the toughest fans in the world. I was cursed. I had things thrown at me by old women, and any job in show business would be easier after trying to entertain Phillies fans. But I really did learn a lot. I was a student at the University of Pennsylvania, and I did it for 2 summers. It went so well. Well, how well did that job go? It went so well that I decided to do something much, much easier after that and joined the Israeli army. After college, I moved to Israel, volunteered for a combat unit of the IDF. I was a tank gunner in the Golan Heights and in South Lebanon. This is me next to another lone soldier named Tim. You can see Mount Hermon, the only place you can ski in Israel, behind us. After that, I moved back to the US, began my career in comedy, performing everywhere, but I really sort of early on knocked out a specialty in the Jewish world. And you do a lot of weird shows when you perform for Jews. This is one of my strangest shows ever. This is for the Chabad World Headquarters in Brooklyn, New York. As you may notice, it's an all-male crowd. It's the only time in my career that I was hired to do 2 shows back to back. First, the show for the men, and then the show for the women. They could not be in the same room at the same time, because if they were laughing together, that could lead to dancing. I don't know if you guys get that joke, but that's the punchline of a very old Jewish joke. Well, I lived in the US for 20 years, and then about 4 years ago, it all came full circle. We moved back to Israel. I have 4 kids, 2 of whom are in the Israeli army right now. This is one of my twins right here in the orange beret, Noam. She's right here at the end of basic training, receiving her beret from her commander at the end of her hike. She has a very cool job. She's a chemical warfare instructor, which means she goes around Israel instructing the male combat soldiers how to fight in a chemical war. God forbid we would have one. But here you can see they just did a training drill with their gas masks on. And her sister Stav right here is in the combat engineers and intelligence working near Gaza. So it really is full circle now that we're back in Israel. And at the end of my shows, usually I do a little Q&A. I'm not sure with 200 plus people it'll be possible. Maybe we can try. But if you have questions about Israel, comedy in the age of Zoom, I'm happy to answer those. Now, another question people have is, what does your mother think about the fact that you're a stand-up comedian? I mean, 9 years at Solomon Schechter Jewish Day School, 4 years at the University of Pennsylvania, and you become a comedian. What does your mom say? Well, she doesn't know. She still thinks I'm in medical school. She believes I'm in one of these long MD, PhD tracks. So if you happen to run into Carol Chasnoff from Evanston, Illinois, do not tell her that this is what I'm doing. I don't want to burst her bubble. She thinks I'm going to be a doctor. But the truth is, my mom is a source of a lot of my humor. Not just me, but a lot of comedians. We get a lot of our first jokes from our families, because where do you turn for comedy? You turn to what you have in front of you. And my mom was the first source of some of the humor I have in my act. I love my mom, don't get me wrong, but she is what you would call a typical Jewish mother. And by that, I mean 2 things. First, the guilt. I don't know what Jewish guilt is like in Canada, but I grew up on the North Shore of Chicago, sort of a wealthy suburb. There is a ton of Jewish guilt in that part of those parts of the United States. Jewish mothers, the way they control their children is by giving them Jewish guilt. My mom gave me tons of guilt when I was a kid. She had a bumper sticker on her car that said, if my son worked just a little bit harder, I too would have an honor roll student at Solomon Schechter Day School. And it worked. I got good grades. I got into a good college, all because of the guilt my mother gave me. Now, the other thing my mom did is she worried about everything. All mothers worry. I know that parents worry, it's part of being a parent, but what is it about you Jewish mothers? We have many Jewish mothers in our crowd tonight. What is it about you guys? It's that ability you have to worry about every situation, even the harmless ones. Anything can hurt you as long as you do it correctly. That is what the Jewish mother believes. And I am going to prove to you right now that Jewish mothers can truly worry about even the most harmless of situations. I'm going to ask you to open your chat boxes at the bottom of your screen. There's that little bubble. If you click that, we can chat. I'm going to ask you a few questions about harmless scenarios from my life. Let's see who here is the first Jewish mother who can tell me, why was my mother worried in this harmless situation? Okay, true story number one. Growing up in Chicago, we didn't take many big family vacations. We usually drove to St. Louis or to the Wisconsin Dells. But one summer, my father planned what he called the epic family vacation. We were going to fly from Chicago to San Francisco, then rent a car and drive the most beautiful highway in America. It's called the Pacific Coast Highway, Highway 1, from San Francisco down to Los Angeles. Beautiful view. We would then go to Disneyland outside of LA in Anaheim and then fly back to Chicago. But my mother said, no, Ira, that is dangerous. We should fly to Los Angeles, rent a car, drive up to San Francisco, and then fly home. Now, as you may have realized, this is the exact same trip, just backwards. Does anyone know what was my mother worried about? And I must say, before I could even finish the story, I think it is Wayne Potishner wrote, you would fall into the ocean. Yes. Congratulations. That is absolutely correct. That is how Jewish mothers think. And I think a few more of you are now chatting in the correct answer. Driving south on Highway 1, I'm next to the cliff and I could plummet into the Pacific Ocean. Driving north, there's a mountain where all you have to worry about are boulders falling onto your car. So very good. Yes, you got that one right before I could even finish. Here's the follow-up question, though. Let's see if you can get this. We did, in fact, fly to Los Angeles first, like my mother suggested. But what did my mother do without telling us? What did she arrange? And we did not find this out until we got to the airport for our flight. Well, it turned out that my mother had booked our family onto two separate planes. My dad and myself flew on one plane. My mom and my two brothers flew on a different plane. The five of us were split up. And when I asked my mother, why can't we fly together? She refused to tell me. What was my mother thinking? And I love how you phrase this. Okay, so Susan says, in case one parent died. That's a very direct answer. You did not sugarcoat that. Cindy's a little gentler. So if there's a crash, you don't lose the whole family. There really is a range, but the bottom line is it's all the same answer. If one of the planes goes down and you're split up, well, it's okay. Only half the family goes down with it. That way, the other half can live on and mourn them in misery and guilt for the rest of their existence, which is what we call a happy Jewish upbringing. I mean, that's just normal, right? In our people. So very good. You guys are 2 for 2. But I have bad news. Those were the easy questions. Here's the hard one. So listen closely. Okay. Final question. On my 12th birthday, my Zady. Now I need to stop here. We have a big crowd. I don't want to use words that some people might be unfamiliar with. Zady is a Yiddish word. And I imagine we have some people here who speak Yiddish, but we might have some of the younger generation who don't know what Yiddish is. So I'll explain. Yiddish is a language that some Jewish people speak and have spoken in our history. Yiddish is a beautiful language. It's a combination of Hebrew, German, and bronchitis. It's a gorgeous language. Phlegm is a vowel in this language. Mucus is a pronoun. And I call my grandparents Bubby and Zady. Bubby is Yiddish for grandma. Zady is Yiddish for shrinking man, because every Jewish grandfather is actually slowly going below sea level. You might pay attention to this with your own grandparents, or those of you who are grandfathers, you might notice it yourselves, that Jewish grandfathers actually are getting shorter with time. But you would think they would lose weight as they were shrinking. But incredibly, Jewish Zadys have the ability to get shorter and heavier at the same time. They grow this round sort of extra abdomen that I call the Zady Crotch. It's like this, it's inflatable. You could take a pin and pop it and it would blow away. But they hide it very well by pulling their pants up to their chin. Only Zadys could get away with dressing like this. I've tried it. It doesn't look cool at my age. In any case, back to the story. So my Zady, my grandfather, on my 12th birthday, I was a huge sports fan as a kid. I still am. On my 12th birthday, my Zady gave me a Chicago Bears football jersey. That's the American football team, the Chicago Bears, with the number on the back, 34. That was my favorite player, Walter Payton. Except on the back of this jersey, instead of Payton, it had my name, Joel. Well, my mother wouldn't allow me to wear this jersey outside the house. Does anyone know why? What was my mother afraid of? Now, I thought no one would get this one, but Sam Ginsberg was first. He said someone would kidnap you. And Wayne Potisher was next, so you wouldn't be kidnapped. I don't like to call out people in my audience, but this Wayne guy, I don't know if you have kids, Wayne. If you do, put them in therapy. You are an incredible worrier. You'd make a great Jewish mother, Wayne. In any case, they are correct. I could get kidnapped. Now, those of you who aren't Jewish, maybe we have people who aren't Jewish. And first of all, if we have people here who aren't Jewish, welcome. It's wonderful to have people who are normal in our audience as well. But if you're not Jewish, you might be wondering, how can your name on your jersey lead to kidnapping? Well, ask a Jewish mother. It's very simple. You see, I would be at the park and a stranger would see me in that jersey and he would read my name and then he would call me by name. Hey, Joel, you don't remember me, but I'm an old friend of the family. Yeah, your mom sent me to come pick you up. Come, get into my car. I'll drive you home. And he would lure me into his vehicle, and that would be the end of me. And we learn two things from this story. Number one, Jewish mothers truly are capable of worrying about everything. And number two, we learn that this is why there are no Jewish athletes. It's not that we're bad at sports. Our mothers won't to wear the jerseys. So now you know how Jews think and a little bit about why we are the way we are. We really are a fascinating people. Now, you might be wondering, what about Jewish fathers? There's lots of jokes about Jewish mothers, and yes, there are lots of great jokes about Jewish mothers. As a fan of Jewish humor, I can tell you some of our best classic jokes have to do with Jewish mothers. You know, there's the one, what's the difference between a Jewish mother and a Rottweiler? Eventually, a Rottweiler will let go. How many Jewish mothers does it take to screw in a light bulb? Don't bother, I'll just sit here alone in the dark. But you're wondering, are there any jokes about Jewish fathers? Well, I must say, in all my years of performing Jewish stand-up comedy, only once has someone come up to me after a show and told me a joke about a Jewish father. And it goes like this. It's about a young boy who comes home from school and he's very excited. He says, Dad, guess what? I got a part in the school play. And his father says, that's wonderful, son. What part did you get? And the boy says, I got the part of the Jewish father. And his dad says, no. You go back to school. You tell your teacher you want a speaking part. Now, is that a joke about Jewish fathers, or is that really just a Jewish mother joke in disguise? I actually think it's a Jewish mother joke in disguise, but it's the closest we can come to a joke about Jewish dads. Now, as I mentioned, I myself am a father at this point. I have, God bless them, 4 children. And when you become a Jewish father, you have to make many big decisions. I actually feel it's easier when they're infants, right? You just change diapers, feed them, hug them. Once they get older, you have to start really making the choices. One of my big choices that I had to make was whether or not to send my kids to Jewish day school. Now, I went to Jewish day school when I was a kid. I went to a school called Solomon Schechter in Skokie, Illinois. I learned Hebrew. I learned about Israel. But if you ask me what was the highlight of Jewish day school, it was the basketball team. We had a basketball team. Believe it or not, we had a basketball team at Solomon Schechter. I don't want to brag, but I was the starting center on my Jewish basketball team, 3'9" tall, and I was the starting center. And it was a lot of pressure. I got a lot of Jewish pride by being on my Solomon Schechter basketball team, because here's what they do. When you're on a Jewish team, what they do is there's no other Jewish schools to play against. So they put you in the Catholic League. It was Solomon Schechter every game versus St. Mary's and St. Nick's and Christ is King. And at that point, it really instills you with Jewish pride, because you are not just playing for your school. You are suddenly playing for the entire Jewish people. It's not about whose team is better. It's about whose religion is right. It's holy war. It's the Old Testament versus the New Testament. It's Hashem versus the Father, Son, and Holy Ghost. And that's unfair. That's 3-on-1. We could never cover that kind of offense. We had cheerleaders. You do not know the meaning of the word voluptuous till you have seen a squad of Solomon Schechter cheerleaders coming out at halftime. They would introduce themselves, the Schechter lie, and say, "Hello from Rivka, Malka Chaya," and always that one immigrant girl from Russia, Svetlana, wearing denim skirts that came down to their ankles. Throw the girl up in the air. Oop, I can't catch her. I'm Shomer Negia. Don't touch women. Sorry about that. Only in Jewish day school would you get these kinds of experiences. And I really did have a great experience in Jewish day school. So when it came time to send my kids to kindergarten, I had a debate. Do I do this? Ultimately, I chose to. It was expensive. I have 4 kids, as I said. There was 1 year when we were living in New Rochelle, New York, when all 4 of my kids were in Jewish day school at the same time. I lovingly refer to this as the most expensive year of my life. I don't know what Jewish day school costs in Toronto. I know you have some great schools, the Robin School, and I think Chat, right? Well, I don't know what tuition is there. Does anyone want to take a guess at what it costs to send even one child to the Solomon Schechter of Westchester, New York? I will tell you, it's unbelievable. $28,500 a week to attend the Solomon Schechter Day School of Westchester, plus tuition. That's just the kosher meal plan. So people ask me, why did we move to Israel 4 years ago? Well, a big reason is that now I can send my kids to Jewish school without having to pay for it. Jewish education is free in the Jewish state. Now, what they don't tell you is that there's barely any school at all in Israel. Before the pandemic, normal times, you know what the normal school day is here in Israel? 8:30 in the morning till 12:45 in the afternoon. 4 hours, 15 minutes of school. And that's a long day. Sometimes they get out early so the teachers can have, conferences. That's a long day of school. So if you're planning on having a job, working, bringing home a paycheck, there's just no time to do that. So it's a good thing they don't pay tuition. They don't charge tuition, because we would not be able to pay it. But in any case, that was one of my first big decisions I had to make as a father. I also read all these studies. How do you keep a kid Jewish? And I knew Jewish day school was important, but it turns out there is something even more important than Jewish day school in terms of keeping kids Jewish. And Federation discovered this. I think you have Jewish Federation in Canada. They do these huge studies about what will keep kids Jewish. They're multi-billion-dollar studies, very expensive. So they do one every 3 or 4 weeks. And the study always says the same thing, that it turns out summer camp is the best way to keep kids Jewish outside of growing up in Israel. And I don't know if you guys send your kids to Jewish summer camp. I know you have Ramah in Ramah, Canada, which I've been to perform. Great camp. I love the names for our Jewish summer camps. And I know this because I've been to many. I've performed comedy at all types of summer camps. And I must say, the names of the non-Jewish summer camps are always so cool. They have amazing names. Camp Tomahawk, Camp Eagle Feather, Camp Kill a Bear. Rawr. I went to Mahane Ethel Rosenzweig when I was a kid. Yeah. You know what my activity was? I knit an Afghan. Actually, it was a yarmulke that turned into an Afghan. That's how bored I was at Jewish camp. I just kept crocheting and crocheting for 8 weeks. It was very intimidating. My best friend growing up is Catholic. He went to Boy Scout camp. And man, every August he would come home with these great stories. Yeah, we went horseback riding. I was like, really? I davened. That's what I did at summer camp. You didn't learn how to jet ski? I'm like, nope. I fasted for the 9th of Av. Yeah, my parents are still trying to get a refund for that day. That's what Jewish summer camp is. We go to remember the destruction of the temple. Only Jews would send their kids off to do that. But eventually I sent my kids to Jewish summer camp as well, because I was going to do everything I could to keep my kids Jewish. And the biggest step, of course, is moving to Israel. We moved here just over 4 years ago in the summer of 2015. We sold everything we owned, left the US, and traveled around the world for 1 year, backpacking through South America, Southeast Asia, Southern Africa, Australia, the Middle East a little bit. And during that trip, my wife, who's a Sabra Israeli, and I, we decided, since we have nowhere really to go, let's try Israel. We've always wanted to raise the kids here. She was in the army here. I had done the army. We wanted our older two to have that experience. So we moved here. What's it like? Where did I get this Israel bug? I fell in love with Israel at a young age. I went to, like I said, day school camp. My first Israel trip was incredible. I went with Camp Ramah when I was 17 years old. I don't know if anyone here's ever been on a teen tour to Israel, but they're very dangerous. And I don't mean dangerous in terms of danger of physically or terrorism. What I mean is dangerous in terms of what happens to the kids when they come, because you're 17, your hormones are raging. And what they want you to do is fall in love with the Golan Heights and Masada and the Western Wall. But what you actually fall in love with are the Israelis, because oh my God, you're 17, you step off the plane and the first thing you notice, those of you who've been to Israel, you know this is true. You step off the plane and the first thing you realize in Ben Gurion Airport is how beautiful these Israelis are. Oh, the women are all exotic and tan and fit with their curly Mediterranean hair, and the men are these hunks with muscles and crew cuts. And it's so odd because they've got the same roots as we do, right? Eastern Europe, Poland, Germany, except they look like supermodels and we look like Jews. How did that happen? That's not fair. And the group I fell in love with the most were the Israeli soldiers. They were so gorgeous, these soldiers. I had a crush on every Israeli soldier I met because they were 18. I was 17. They were 1 year older. And yet they were so much cooler than I was. I mean, they had berets and machine guns and uniforms. And then there was me, slathered in sunscreen, wearing a fanny pack. Remember those before they were cool? A fanny pack? You know what was inside my fanny pack? 6 weeks worth of lactose pills. That's how I walked around Israel, with a fanny pack stuffed with lactose pills in case I wanted to have pizza or ice cream. Who would you rather be, that guy or the hunky Israeli soldier? Well, I knew I wanted to be in the IDF, so I came home and I told my parents I am joining the Israeli army. And they asked me why. Why? It's not just to be an Israeli cool, right? Is there more to it? And I thought about it, and I explained to them, it's not just to be one of these, Lions of Judah. I also feel like it's our duty. I feel like if we're going to call Israel our homeland, that we need to protect it too. I explained to them that even though I grew up in a pretty good Jewish community outside of Chicago, I still felt more at home in Israel as a Jew than I did in the United States. And I still feel that now. That's one of the great things about living here, is that my kids don't have to explain who they are. Because even though I went to Solomon Schechter, I was always the spokesman for Judaism when I got out of my little Jewish world. When I was in the Cub Scouts, I had to explain Judaism to all my fellow Cub Scouts and the Scoutmaster. I went to public high school after Solomon Schechter. And public high school, I suddenly became the representative of Judaism at my public high school. I had to explain to my freshman year, my 9th grade physics teacher, why I couldn't take our midterm because it was on the first day of Sukkot. Now, has anyone here ever had to explain Sukkot to a high school teacher? You sound like a complete idiot. I was like, well, yeah, you see, summer is over. It's getting chilly and rainy. So my family is going to go live outside on the front lawn for a week. Yeah, we're living in a booth. In fact, we're going to Home Depot today after school to buy some lumber and tarp. Even though we don't know how to even hold a hammer, we're going to build a booth on our front lawn. And they're predicting a huge snowstorm. So we have to make sure we can see the clouds. That's a mitzvah. And there's squirrels with rabies. So you know what we're going to do? We're going to hang some popcorn from the roof and gourds and squash. And we're going to buy a lemon that costs $900. Yep. We're not even going to eat it. It's not even organic. It's not even edible. It's just going to rot on the dining room table until Thanksgiving. That is what it is like to grow up in the US. When you're Jewish, you're always explaining, keeping kosher. I've kept kosher since I was a kid. It makes sense to me. Have you ever had to explain keeping kosher to somebody who's not Jewish? We've all had that conversation. It's very awkward, right? Maybe you have a new cleaning lady come over to the house for the first time. You have to explain the kosher rules. You see, that sponge cannot touch that sponge. If it does, we have to boil the entire kitchen. And then we're bulldozing the house. And then you're fired. We are a very strict, regimented people. Tefillin. I'm a conservative Jew, so I put on tefillin every morning that I feel like it. That's what we do in the conservative movement. And if you don't know what tefillin is, I'll explain. Tefillin are the black leather straps that we pull on our arms and head every morning. And because we Jews, we know that the best way to start the day is to cut off our circulation for 45 minutes. I mean, who needs yoga when you can give yourself an aneurysm? We are a smart people. But in Israel, I have one of the greatest things that happens in Israel. You see people walking down the street wearing tefillin. It's so cool. They're late for synagogue. They're putting it on as they walk. I just love that image. Now, in America, it's problematic. I travel when I'm in the States to perform comedy. I travel with my tefillin in my carry-on luggage. And you know what happens? I get stopped in the airports because I'm male and flying alone. And they pat me down and then they open my bag and they take out my tefillin. And they ask me, what is this? And how do you even begin to explain tefillin to TSA security guards in the airport? How does that conversation even start? How do you explain 8-foot-long leather straps to people who work for the US government? They ask me, do you use this in the bedroom? And I tell them, only if I can't find 9 other men. And that is not the answer you want to give to government officials in the United States. I mean, that just raises so many questions. They get suspicious. You mean older men, mature? I'm like, yeah, at least 13 years old. What are you worried about? So that's what's great about living in Israel. I don't have to explain to the masses. I can just fight with other Jews about the tiny minutia that we argue about here in the Jewish state. So at this point, I actually want to open up the room. We're going to try this, despite the fact that we are now up to 226 screens, which is amazing. I'm going to try opening it up to any questions people have. And usually I ask people to go off of mute and raise their hand or to chat that in. I think tonight, given the number of people, 250 people or 1,000 screens, we're going to ask you only to chat in your question. So if you have a question about life in Israel or my kids' army experience or comedy and performing in the age of Zoom, you can ask any of those questions. Feel free. I agree with the rabbi that we're all going, Rabbi Sachs mentioned that he's doing things he never went to rabbinical school for, learning production. And we're all sort of improvising, and comedy on Zoom is a new phenomenon. So if you have questions about that, go ahead and shoot them in. So someone asked, tell us about your long-suffering wife. Well, Nancy Mock, I will try not to take that personally. But the truth is, my wife is from Bnei Brak, Israel. You may have heard of Bnei Brak. It is a very religious city nowadays. But when she was growing up, it was just sort of a normal town. They had a religious section, but it was like a suburb of Tel Aviv. And that's where she grew up. She went to, grew up here, did the army here, but then she moved to the United States to become a shlicha. As you know, they always send the best Israelis to our summer camps and day schools and hillels on college campuses to woo us to come to Israel. And that's what her job was. She was at the Brooklyn College Hillel in New York, and we met at a Hillel conference. Though I must say, she always felt like there was a part of her that wasn't fully alive outside of Israel, and she really missed it. And now that we're back, she feels more complete. I think Israelis, they have a very different mentality than us. They speak their minds. They have a way of communicating that's very direct. And I think she felt a little censored there. Whereas here, Israelis are much more open, and that part of her can finally flourish. So I said, how did I meet her? What are the opportunities for an English-speaking comedian in Israel? Linda asked. That's a great question. I have performed comedy in Hebrew. I must say it's very difficult. It's not just the language barrier. I'm fluent in Hebrew, but I think to perform comedy, you need to be beyond fluent. You need to be native and even have a complete mastery of the language, because you need to be able to be fast on your feet, deal with circumstances as they come up. And I have that little lag when I'm performing in Hebrew, in that it sort of harms the act. So I do perform here in English. Before the pandemic, tour groups who would come over. There's actually a tour group from Hadassah, from Toronto, that was here a few years ago, and I did a show for them. And also a big audience here is lone soldiers. A lone soldier these are the kids who come over from other countries to serve in the Israeli army, and they live on kibbutzim together. A kibbutz will take in a group, and I'll perform for them as well. So there are opportunities to perform in English. But most of my business is in North America. Before the pandemic, I was flying back once every month. So in 4 years' time, I was in I was in North America 52 times, and got a lot of frequent flyer miles on Delta. It's all on Zoom now, obviously, but we're actually looking that maybe by early spring I could be touring again as the vaccines roll out. The question: are the twins identical or fraternal? We think they're identical, but if you really want to get technical here, there's something called a fused placenta, and that's when you can't really tell for sure if they're identical or fraternal. They look alike, but genetically we didn't have them tested. But they're very close. They're best friends, and in that sense, they are identical. Someone asked, I do stand up and have found there's a real difference between North American and Israeli audiences. Have you found this? That was, I think, Alf Quinter asked. Yes, it's not just the act that's different performing in Israel. The audience is very different. I think there's an agreement in the US and Canada. There's an agreement between comedian and audience. The audience says, we will sit here, we will pay attention. You be funny, we'll laugh. That's the unwritten agreement we have going on. In Israel, they really expect you to be hilarious from the moment you step foot on the stage. There's no warm-up period. There's no sort of getting to know you. It's tak, 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 as they say. You got to be funny right away. And also the audience likes to be in the show. In the US, and I think in Canada too, people tend to avoid the front row. They don't want to be made fun of by the comedian. Whereas in Israel, they seek out the front row. They want to be brought up on stage, brought into the act. It's a much more aggressive performance, just like Israel in general, their mentality. It's a much more aggressive country where people speak their minds and will get in your face. The comedy is like that as well. Someone else asked, Helen asked, what are the other kids doing? It's like I have all these other Jewish mothers now. What are the other kids doing with their time? Are they okay? The other kids, we're doing Zoom school. We keep going back and forth. Israel was one of the first countries to solve the pandemic well. And then we had a huge second wave and we went back on lockdown. Right now, we're 5 days into our third lockdown. We went into a lockdown last Sunday because our numbers are going up. So that means our kids one of them is in doing school through Zoom, but the other one is going to school. They found that younger kids, it actually doesn't affect the numbers if younger kids go to school. And the hard part is the social aspect. I think, not having the kids with other kids their age, that has been, I think, the hardest part for them and the hardest part for us. And also the activities, having to do basketball practice over Zoom in your living room as opposed to with the other guys. I really am I really am curious what this generation of kids will be like. Will this affect them long term, or will it just be a blip on their radar? But they are certainly having a childhood experience that none of us have. Do I like the humor of Jewish comedians like Jerry Seinfeld and Jackie Mason? Ellen asked. Well, those are two very different comedians, and I might upset a lot of people here. I am not a big Jackie Mason fan, but it might be generational. It might just be that I'm in a different age bracket than his prime audience. But I've just kind of found his humor to be a little bit of the same joke over and over, and based on stereotypes that aren't necessarily true. But I think a certain generation really loved them, so he's not necessarily my favorite. Seinfeld, I am a big favorite. Now, is Seinfeld a Jewish comedian? He's a comedian who's Jewish, and I think his sensibility is very Jewish. The whole questioning and observing, that's a very sort of Jewish characteristic, though his humor isn't, per se, the material isn't Jewish. But what I like about Seinfeld is his writing. To me, I think good comedy is writing that is efficient, that uses the minimum amount of words to get to the punchline. And he is, Seinfeld is one of those comedians who really will spend years crafting a single joke, finding out when to pause, when to take a word out, or introduce a new word just to make the joke flow better. And to me, that's the similarity of Torah and comedy. They say that there's no word in the Torah that's extra. Every word, every letter is there for a purpose and cannot be ignored. So when you're analyzing Torah, you have to pay attention to every word. And I think good humor for me is like that as well, that every word makes a difference, and you really want to pause at the right times and have the words carry meaning. How long does it take you to write or prepare a routine? Jokes come and go. There's a core group of jokes I've had for 20 years, and then there are other jokes that will come and go with time. Some of my earliest favorite jokes, I can't even remember. They just sort of drifted out of the act. And then there are new ones I'm working on now that have to do with the pandemic. Although, the question is, once the pandemic is done, will people want to hear about it, or will they be so anxious to have it in the past that they don't want to keep being reminded of it? So I think it's a balancing act. I don't do political humor. That's one thing I don't do. I don't do jokes about presidents or Trump or anything, for a few reasons. First, I just feel like it opens up too many Pandora boxes, and people will be offended. They came to have a good time. You're not going to get the whole audience on board. And second, it just changes too quickly. By the time you write that joke well, the news has changed, and it's not going to be around anymore. So political is just one area I kind of stay away from. Who are you going to vote for? Well, it depends. Which election? I mean, we're about to have our fourth, but there'll be a fifth and a sixth as well. I've never voted so much in my life. I've voted more in Israel than I have in all my years living in America. That's for sure. Any other questions people have? What about Borat? I like Sacha Baron Cohen. I think he's I think he's incredibly intelligent. I don't always like all of his characters or what they do, but I certainly respect what he's done. He took comedy to a new place. That's another thing I really respect is any artist who can take their art form to a place that was wholly unexpected, and he did that with the interview format. Well, I feel like I've answered every question that's come my way. I'm now going to conclude with two of my favorite all-time Jewish jokes, and then it's 3:30 in the morning. I'm going to go to bed. I think that's a fair thing to do. So here's the first joke. This is from Rabbi Moshe Waldoks. Rabbi Sachs, at the beginning, he said he opened a book of Jewish humor. I don't know which one it is, but Rabbi Moshe Waldoks is the co-editor of the Big Book of Jewish Humor, which some of you may have, and he's also a friend of mine. And he told me this joke. When the pandemic first hit, I emailed him and I said, Moshe, are there any jokes that can teach us how to handle the pandemic? And he emailed me back this one. It's about a priest, a minister, and a rabbi. They're sitting around talking about what they want people to say at their funeral. And the priest says, at my funeral, I want people to say that I was a kind and generous human being. And the minister says, at my funeral, I want people to say that I was always there to listen. And the rabbi says, at my funeral, I want people to say, look, he's moving. And the reason I think that's related to the pandemic is it's about hope. I think Jews, we have the chutzpah to believe that no matter how dire the situation, there is a light at the end of the tunnel, that the story is not yet over. And it might be absurd at times, but I think it's what's kept us going all these years. And I think it's what's kept us going through the pandemic, is that belief that, hey, we're moving. Just keep moving. We'll get through this. So that's number one. This second joke I like is, well, the reason I like it is because the characters don't have to be Jewish. And yet, if you make them Jewish, the joke is actually funnier, I think. So it's about a woman in South Florida. She's listening to the radio when all of a sudden they come on with a special report. The broadcaster says, "We need to let you know about a dangerous situation. There is a car driving the wrong way on Interstate 95 south of Fort Lauderdale." Well, immediately the woman gets on her phone and she calls her elderly father on his cell phone. She says, Dad, you got to be careful. There's a car driving the wrong way on I-95. And he says, one car? Try all of them. Now, I didn't say he was Jewish. I didn't say she was Jewish, but if you picture them, I think it's almost automatic to picture these guys as Jewish. There's something Jewish about that joke. I think when characters are Jewish, it actually makes the story funnier. Maybe that's the moral of the story here. Before I go, I just want to point you to a few things I'll be doing in the future. One of my resolutions for 2021, I'm starting a new podcast that's called Interesting Jews. I've been doing comedy in the Jewish world and writing in the Jewish world for about 20 years, and I've met a lot of really interesting characters from all over the spectrum of Judaism: rabbis, educators, journalists, tennis coaches, athletes. And in this podcast, Interesting Jews, I'm just going to talk with them and not necessarily about Jewish topics, but what they all have in common is that they're somehow connected to the fate of the Jewish people. So it hasn't launched yet. It'll probably launch in about a month. But the best place to find out about it, I'm going to email you or put right here the address of my website. And it is just very simple, www.joelchasnoff.com. So if you go there on the contact page, joelchasnoff.com/contact, there's a button to sign up for my newsletter. About 4 times a year, I send out a newsletter with jokes and updates on these other projects I'm working on. If you want to get that newsletter, just click that. There's no spam or anything like that. I also have another project called On One Foot, where every week a different rabbi I know gives a 2 to 3 minute Dvar Torah on that week's Torah portion. And I post these on my website and on my YouTube channel. And again, the newsletter is the best place to find out. So it's I'll just add that, joelchasnoff.com/contact. You can get all that information. Well, Happy New Year, everyone. Thank you so much for joining me. You're still in 2020. I guess you have about 2.5 hours left, but it's been a pleasure. Thank you for hosting me, Rabbi Sachs. I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you so much, Joel. I think people really enjoyed it. There's been great messages, and it's amazing. We really kept the audience this whole time. When I do classes, I watch over the hour. The numbers slowly drop off on Zoom, and you kept it. See, it's dropping now that I have it back. So it's not so funny back there. No, really, Joel. Thank you so much for joining us all the way from Israel. It was a big treat, a great way to bring in the new year. And to everyone else from Beth Tikva, really just want to say thank you for joining us tonight. And L'chaim, have a wonderful, happy 2021. Thank you, everybody. We'll unmute everyone so we can go back to that cacophony as people say goodbye to each other, but have a great rest of your night. Thanks again, Joel.